You don't need the money anyway. My mother said it the way she always said things that were supposed to end the conversation, like her words were a lid and my feelings were something embarrassing I should keep covered. She stood in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, leaning one hip against my counter, scrolling through her phone like she had all the time in the world. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look nervous. She looked mildly amused, like I was the one being dramatic for staring at the notification on my screen as if it had claws. Royal Horizon Cruises, Premium Suite Package. $10,846.19. It wasn't just the number. It was the way the number sat there, bold and clean, like it belonged to someone else's life. Like it wasn't about me at all. My name is Maeve Willey, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a senior accountant at a gaming studio, the kind of job where people assume you're good with money, calm under pressure, responsible. I am those things. I've been those things since I was a kid, because in my family, responsible didn't mean admired, it meant assigned. I own my small apartment, the one with creaky floors and a balcony I've never decorated because I'm always waiting until life settles down. I also own a 3-bedroom house I bought 5 years ago as an investment, the one I told myself would be my safety net and my future. That house is where my parents live. And my younger sister, Sloane. For 3 years, rent-free. Mom, I said, and I could hear how careful my voice was, like I was talking to a dog that might bite. You used my credit card without asking. She waved her hand. Stop. It's family. That doesn't make it not fraud. She laughed, an actual laugh, like I'd just tried stand-up comedy in my own kitchen. Fraud. Maeve, please. Don't talk like some stranger. You make more than enough. You've always been fine. Always been fine. That phrase hit me the way it always hit me, the way it had hit me at 12 when I got sick and still made my own dinner because you're the strong one, the way it hit me at 19 when I worked 2 jobs through college and Sloane dropped out after 1 semester because she's sensitive. Fine meant no one had to check on me. Fine meant no one had to ask. Fine meant, in my mother's world, I existed to absorb whatever landed on me. She turned her phone screen toward me, excited now, like she was showing me pictures of a baby or a puppy. Look at this suite. It has a balcony and a private dining package. And Sloane really needs this, honey. She's been so stressed. I stared at the pictures. White sheets. Ocean view. Champagne. A smiling couple in sunglasses holding hands like life was soft and easy. Stressed about what? I heard myself ask. My mother's face tightened for half a second. Don't start. You know what she's been through. What she'd been through was a breakup with a man she'd dated for 6 months. A man who, according to Sloane's tearful phone call, had changed when he suggested she might consider, in his words, doing something with her life. She took that as betrayal. And apparently, my family's response to betrayal was to spend my money until it hurt. When does it leave? I asked. My mother's eyes brightened, as if my question was permission. Saturday morning. 12 days. We'll finally breathe for once. Your father hasn't had a real vacation in years. You went to Florida last summer. That doesn't count, we stayed with your aunt. I wanted to laugh, but it came out as air. Just a long exhale that felt like something leaving me. Because of course it didn't count when it didn't feel luxurious. Of course it didn't count when it wasn't paid for by me. The more I looked at my mother standing there in my kitchen, the more I realized she wasn't even attempting to convince me anymore. She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't pretending. She was announcing. And something inside me, something old and tired, shifted. I didn't grow up in a home where you were allowed to say no. Not unless you wanted the cold shoulder, the guilt speeches, the after all I'd done sermons delivered like a judge handing down a sentence. In our family, Sloane was the sun and the rest of us were just expected to orbit. Sloane was beautiful in a way my mother understood, soft features, bright smile, the kind of charm that made people excuse her. She was also allergic to accountability. And my parents had spent her entire life treating that like a delicate medical condition. When Sloane wanted dance classes, I gave up art camp. When Sloane needed a car at 16, my college savings mysteriously had to be adjusted. When she decided school was too stressful, my parents blamed the school. When I was stressed, my mother told me to stop being intense. When my father's back gave out, their rental lease suddenly became impossible, and my mother called me with her voice already set on the outcome. "We just need 6 months," she said. "A year max. You have the house. You're not using it. We'll take care of it, Maeve. You'll barely notice we're there." That was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, I paid the property taxes. I covered the insurance. I handled repairs. I replaced the water heater. I paid for roof work. When utilities spiked, my mother would text me a sad face and a sentence about how hard things are, and I would transfer money because the idea of them struggling made my stomach twist. And I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was love. I told myself every family had a dynamic, and ours was just complicated. Then my mother walked into my kitchen and casually stole almost $11,000, and I realized I'd been calling it complicated to avoid calling it what it really was. Exploitation. My mother stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse like she'd accomplished something. "I knew you'd understand. You always do." She leaned in and patted my hand, the way you pat a child who's learned a lesson. And that was when I knew this wouldn't stop. Not with the cruise. Not with the next emergency. Not with Sloane's next hard time. Not with my father's next ache. Not with my mother's next dramatic sigh. They weren't going to wake up one day and become fair. They weren't going to suddenly feel grateful. They weren't going to stop taking until something forced them to. My mother grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Oh, and don't forget, I need you to send me that card again, the one you use for the house stuff. The grocery store kept declining it last week." It was embarrassing. Embarrassing. Not stealing. Not using. Not charging. Embarrassing. I watched her leave. I listened to the door click shut. I stood in the silence of my kitchen and felt my body buzzing, like every nerve had finally stopped numbing itself. I looked down at the cruise charge again. Then I opened my laptop. Not because I was spiraling. Because I was thinking. The house. Maple Drive. My house. I pulled up the property details, the market estimates, the neighborhood comps. I knew enough about numbers to know what my future could look like if I stopped bleeding money into people who treated my work like a family trust fund. And as I stared at the screen, I felt something settle into place. They'd be gone for 12 days. 12 days with no interruptions. No surprise visits. No, "we need to talk." No barrage of calls. 12 days where they couldn't guilt me in real time. I whispered it out loud, not a prayer, more like a decision. "Okay." I didn't say it like a daughter begging for peace. I said it like a woman drawing a line. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of what happened after the line. I was more scared of what would happen if I never drew it at all. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was racked with guilt, not yet. It was more like my mind had finally stopped protecting me. Every memory I'd filed away under normal family stuff came back out of the drawer at once, stacked neatly, labeled with numbers, like evidence. At 2 a.m. I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, bank statements pulled up, credit card history scrolling like a confession. I told myself I was only looking for the cruise charge so I could dispute it, report it, do the sensible thing. But I didn't stop at the cruise. I couldn't. Because once you see the pattern, you either look away again or you follow it all the way to the truth. The first transfer was small, a few $100s here and there. Just until Friday. Just until your dad's check comes in. Just until we get back on our feet. Then the numbers got bigger. Utilities I didn't live in. Repairs I didn't benefit from. Emergency grocery runs that somehow always happened the week Sloane posted pictures of new shoes. By 4 in the morning, the total was sitting at the bottom of my spreadsheet. Like a cruel little joke. $71,000. Not counting the house itself. $71,000 in 3 years. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, and I realized something that made my throat tighten. If a friend told me this story, I'd be furious on her behalf. If I read it online, I'd call it abuse. But because it was my mother's voice, because it was my father's tired sigh, because it was my sister's tearful "you don't understand," I'd convinced myself it was love with sharp edges. Outside my window, Columbus was quiet. The streetlights made the snow piles at the curb look pale and soft. Everything looked calm. My life wasn't calm. It was controlled. Saturday morning came fast. I expected my mother to text me something syrupy from the port, a picture, a heart emoji, a final shove of guilt to remind me who I was supposed to be. Instead, at 9:12 a.m., I got a photo. All 3 of them on the ship's deck, champagne flutes raised, the skyline behind them like a set piece. My father stood straighter than I'd seen him stand in years. My mother wore a bright sundress I'd never seen, her hair done like she'd been saving it for a special occasion. Sloane had that sun-kissed glow she always seemed to have, like struggle never lasted long enough to leave a mark. The caption read, "Thanks for making dreams happen. Not thanks for helping. Not sorry for taking. Dreams happen." Like I was a fairy godmother they'd tricked into granting a wish. And again, they hadn't invited me. Not that I wanted to go, not that I could take the time off work, but the exclusion hit anyway. It told me, plainly, that the money was mine and the family was theirs. I didn't reply. I opened my contacts and scrolled to a name I'd kept there for years like a fire extinguisher I hoped I'd never need. Marisol Trent, realtor. She'd helped me buy the apartment. She'd helped me buy the house on Maple Drive. She'd always been brisk, smart, and quietly kind in a way that didn't feel performative. We'd exchanged holiday cards once. She had texted me twice in the last year, gentle little nudges about how hot the market was. My thumb hovered over the call button. This was the moment where I could still pretend. Where I could breathe through it, swallow it, pay it off, and tell myself it would never happen again, the same lie I'd told myself 100 times. I hit call. Maeve, Marisol answered, warm but professional. Hi. Everything okay? I need to talk to you about the house on Maple Drive. There was a pause, a shift in her energy. Are you thinking about selling? Yes. Not maybe. Not someday. Yes. All right, she said, and her voice softened like she understood there was more behind that word than real estate. Tell me what you're thinking. I looked down at the cruise photo still open on my phone. I want to move quickly. How quickly? I swallowed. Within the next week. Marisol was quiet for a beat. Okay. That's doable in certain situations. Cash buyers. Investors. We would price accordingly. Is the home vacant? No tenants? I hesitated. Family. Another beat of silence, and then her voice got careful. Do you have a lease agreement with them? No. Are they aware you're selling? No. I waited for judgment. I waited for the tone shift that says, what kind of daughter are you? Instead, Marisol just asked, are they still living there because you want them to, or because you felt like you had no choice? That question landed in my chest like a weight. I felt like I had no choice, I admitted. Okay, she said gently, like naming it mattered. Then here's what we do. First, I need to see the property condition or at least get updated photos. Second, we need to talk about occupancy laws. In Ohio, even without a lease, people living there can have rights. You can sell, but the buyer will want to understand what they're taking on. Some investors specialize in this. My fingers tightened around my phone. What if the sale closes while they're away? Are they away? They're on a cruise. 12 days. Marisol exhaled slowly, and I pictured her pressing her lips together the way she did when she was thinking. That's an aggressive timeline. But not impossible. How fast could a cash closing happen? I've seen 7 days, she said. 10 is more common if everyone moves quickly. 7 days. My family wouldn't even be back. Something inside me didn't flinch at that the way I expected. It didn't scream. It didn't plead. It just nodded. Can you find someone? I asked. I can call 3 people right now, she said. One in particular, his name's Grant Elwood. He buys properties fast. He's discreet. He doesn't ask for the emotional story, he just solves the transaction. The name didn't matter. The result did. Do it, I said. Maeve, she added, softer, I'm going to ask you something, and you can tell me to mind my business. Are you safe? Like, safe. If these family members find out you're selling, could they retaliate? Could they show up at your work, your apartment? I thought about my mother's smirk, my father's quiet enabling, Sloane's talent for turning herself into the victim in any room. They won't hurt me physically, I said. But they'll try to destroy me emotionally. Marisol's voice turned firm. Then we keep this tight. You get me whatever photos you can. And I'm going to treat this like a confidential situation. After we hung up, I sat very still. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, almost cold. I told myself the plan was simple. Marisol would find an investor, we'd sign, it would be done. My family would come back to a surprise, and I would finally be free. Then I remembered something that made me grab my laptop again. The property portal. I logged into the account I used for both properties, mostly to keep records and documents organized. I hadn't checked it in weeks. I clicked Maple Drive, expecting nothing, just the usual archive of tax documents and repair invoices. But there was a new file. Uploaded 12 days ago. My stomach tightened. I clicked. A form opened on my screen, scanned crooked like someone had rushed it through a cheap printer. The title at the top was clear enough to make my vision sharpen. Residency Declaration. Under the blank lines, I saw handwriting I knew better than my own. My mother's. It claimed the occupants had established long-term residence, requested formal recognition, and referenced ongoing tenancy. My breath went shallow. They weren't just taking my money. They were trying to take my house. They were trying to turn my kindness into a legal chain around my ankle. I read it twice, and the second time I noticed the date in the corner, the way she'd signed it confidently, like she believed the world would always bend for her. My hands didn't shake. That scared me more than shaking would have. Because it meant my anger was past the explosive stage. It was past the stage where you cry and beg and try to negotiate. It had calcified into something sharp. I grabbed my phone and texted Marisol. I just found a residency declaration form with my mother's handwriting. It's dated this month. How soon can we meet? She replied within a minute. Today at 10:30. My office. Bring anything you can, and bring your keys. I took my first personal day in 2 years and told my boss I had a family emergency. For once, the lie didn't taste bitter. It tasted accurate. Marisol's office smelled like coffee and clean paper. She greeted me with a hug that surprised me, then led me into a small conference room with glass walls and a view of downtown. I slid my laptop toward her. This. She read it carefully, her expression tightening. When she looked up, her voice was calm, but her eyes were serious. Okay. This is important, but it's not the end of the world. A form like this doesn't magically give them ownership. But it tells me something. What? It tells me they're not planning to leave, she said plainly. And it tells me they're comfortable taking steps behind your back. I felt my jaw clench. So selling is the right move. Marisol didn't hesitate. If your goal is to get your life back, yes. She opened a folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Grant drove by the property this morning. He's prepared to offer $262, all cash, closing in 7 days. $262, I repeated. It's below full market, she said quickly. You could probably list and get $280, maybe more. But the speed and the occupancy situation are why the number is lower. I thought about the cruise charge. About the $71,000. About my mother's handwriting on that residency form. 7 days. My family would still be on a boat, posting pictures, living like royalty. And I could change the locks on my own life while they were distracted. Marisol leaned forward. I'm going to ask you the same thing I ask every client, just in a different way. Are you sure you want to do this? I looked down at the offer. I thought about all the times I'd tried to be gentle, tried to be fair, tried to be understanding. And then I thought about the way my mother said, "You don't need the money anyway." The way she said it like my work didn't count because it wasn't her work. The way she said it like my life was an extra, and hers was the main story. I'm sure, I said. Marisol nodded once. Okay. Then we move. She slid the paperwork toward me. We can start today. But Maeve, once we do, you need to understand something. When they come back, they're going to call you. They're going to rage. They're going to cry. They're going to threaten. They'll try every key they've ever used on you. My fingers hovered over the pen. I know, I said quietly. And in my head, for the first time, I rehearsed the one sentence I would not bend on. Not this time. The silence didn't last long. 3 days after I blocked them, I heard the pounding. Not a polite knock. Not a hesitant tap. Full fists against wood, loud enough to rattle the frame of my apartment door. The kind of pounding meant to intimidate, meant to announce power. Maeve, my mother's voice cut through the hallway, sharp and furious. I know you're in there. Open this door right now. I didn't move. I stayed at my desk, laptop open, fingers resting on the keyboard as if nothing unusual was happening. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. For years, her voice alone had been enough to spike my anxiety, to pull me into a defensive crouch before she even finished a sentence. Now it just sounded loud. This is insane, she shouted. You can't block your own family. You think you can just disappear after what you did? I heard my father murmur something behind her, his voice low and placating. Then Sloane's voice joined in, higher, panicked. Maeve, please. We just want to talk. We don't understand what we did wrong. That almost made me laugh. They understood perfectly. They just didn't agree that it mattered. The pounding continued. My neighbor across the hall opened her door, confusion written across her face. I heard murmured explanations, my mother switching instantly into performance mode, voice softening, spinning a story about a misunderstanding, about a daughter who was being difficult. Eventually, someone must have complained. The noise stopped. Footsteps retreated. The elevator dinged. I waited another 10 minutes before standing up, just in case. When I opened my door later, there was a letter slid underneath it. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable. Tight, slanted, aggressive even on paper. I sat on my couch and read it slowly. She didn't apologize. She explained. She justified. She reframed. She wrote about sacrifice. About how hard she'd worked. About how my father was unwell. About how Sloane was fragile. About how money wasn't everything, and how hurtful it was that I cared about it now, after all this time. She wrote that she would never forgive me. She ended it by reminding me she was still my mother. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the same folder where I'd saved the voicemails, the texts, the residency form. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because I wanted a record. A reminder for the days when guilt would try to rewrite history. Those days did come. They came quietly, In the mornings when I woke up and reached for my phone out of habit, only to remember there was no one waiting on the other end. They came in waves, usually when I was tired or stressed, when my mind tried to convince me that maybe I'd overreacted, maybe I could have handled it differently. Therapy helped. Naming the pattern helped even more. My therapist didn't call it family drama. She called it what it was. Financial abuse. Emotional conditioning. A dynamic where my value had always been tied to what I could provide. Once she said that, I couldn't unhear it. A month passed. Then two. The legal threat came in a white envelope with a return address I recognized immediately. My mother's name, typed this time, not handwritten. Inside was a letter from a lawyer I'd never heard of, accusing me of illegally evicting family members and demanding compensation. I forwarded it to my own lawyer, the one Marisol had recommended. Her response was almost bored. They have no case, she said. No lease. No tenancy rights. The new owner followed procedure. This is intimidation. And if they sue? They won't. And if they do, we'll shut it down. She was right. Nothing came of it. The threats stopped as abruptly as they'd started, probably when someone finally explained to my mother that outrage wasn't a legal strategy. 6 months passed. I heard updates through a cousin I barely spoke to. My parents were renting a small apartment now. My father had finally applied for disability benefits. Sloane had moved in with a boyfriend she'd met online. None of it stirred anything dramatic in me. No joy. No pity. Just distance. My own life felt quieter. Not empty. Quiet in the way a room feels after a loud appliance finally shuts off. I started cooking again. Real meals, not whatever was fastest and cheapest. I took a vacation, my first real one in years, a week in the mountains where no one needed anything from me. I slept deeply there. One evening, sitting by a cabin window, I realized something that startled me. I didn't miss them. I missed the version of family I'd hoped they could become. There's a difference. 8 months after the sale, my mother found a way to email me through my work account. The message was long and carefully worded, full of concern about her health, about time passing, about regret. She asked if we could reconcile, for the sake of family. I read it slowly, looking for one thing. Accountability. It wasn't there. No apology. No acknowledgement of the credit card. No recognition of the house. Just the same old assumption that reconciliation meant I would give and they would take. I deleted it. Some relationships don't end with explosions. They end with clarity. And clarity, I learned, can be quieter than guilt ever was. Time didn't rush in to fill the space my family left behind. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost cautiously, as if waiting to see whether I would panic and run back to the familiar chaos. I didn't. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet became normal. Not empty. Not lonely. Just calm. I stopped flinching when my phone rang. I stopped bracing myself before opening my email. I stopped waking up with that low-grade dread that had followed me for years, the constant feeling that something was about to go wrong and it would somehow be my responsibility to fix it. I hadn't realized how much of my identity had been built around crisis management until there was no crisis left to manage. Without them, I had to sit with myself. At first, that was uncomfortable. I noticed how often I'd distract myself with work, with errands, with noise. It wasn't boredom I was avoiding. It was the unfamiliarity of peace. Peace felt undeserved at first, like something I hadn't earned because I wasn't actively suffering for someone else. Therapy helped untangle that. My therapist asked me to describe what love had looked like growing up. Not what it was supposed to be, but what it actually felt like in my body. I told her about vigilance. About scanning moods. About learning early which version of my mother I was walking into when I entered a room. About how praise came when I was useful and disappeared when I needed something. She nodded, not surprised. That's not love, she said gently. That's conditioning. That word stayed with me. Conditioning. I had been trained to equate my worth with my usefulness. To believe that being needed was the same as being loved. To feel guilty for wanting things that didn't directly benefit my family. No wonder walking away felt like betrayal to them. I had broken the contract they never asked me to sign, but fully expected me to honor forever. The first holiday without them was strange. I expected grief. Some dramatic ache. A sense of loss. Instead, I felt relief. No passive-aggressive comments. No financial expectations disguised as tradition. No subtle competition over who was more exhausted, more burdened, more deserving of sympathy. I spent the day the way I wanted. I cooked what I liked. I went for a long walk. I didn't explain myself to anyone. That night, I realized something quietly important. I wasn't missing them. I was missing the idea of them. The version of a family that shows up, that respects boundaries, that doesn't treat generosity like an entitlement. Once I separated fantasy from reality, the guilt lost its grip. Information about my parents still reached me occasionally through distant relatives. I didn't seek it out, but I didn't block it either. I wanted to know, in a detached way, how things unfolded once I stepped out of the role I'd played for decades. They struggled. More than they admitted publicly. My mother complained about how unfair life had become now that she didn't have support. She framed everything as abandonment, never as consequence. My father retreated further into silence, letting her control the narrative. And my sister, the one they'd protected at my expense, discovered how quickly people stop accommodating you when you bring nothing to the table. It wasn't satisfying to hear. It was confirming. The pattern didn't change. Only the target did. And that told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, months later, I ran into someone who knew my family well enough to feel comfortable commenting. She tilted her head sympathetically and said, "I heard things have been rough with your parents. They're having a hard time." I smiled politely. "I'm sure they are." She waited for more. For justification. For apology. For explanation. I didn't give it. I had learned something powerful by then. You don't owe people a defense when you choose yourself. That evening, I sat on my balcony and watched the city settle into night. The lights flickered on one by one. The world moved forward without needing my constant intervention. I thought about how close I'd come to spending the rest of my life in quiet resentment, paying for peace I never actually felt. How normalized it had all been. How easy it would have been to keep going, to keep telling myself that this was just how families worked. I felt a flicker of grief then. Not for what I lost, but for how long it took me to stop losing myself. There were moments when doubt still tried to creep in. Usually late at night. Usually after a long day. The old voice would whisper that I was cruel. That I had overreacted. That real daughters didn't do what I did. But I had learned how to answer that voice now. Real daughters don't get robbed by their parents. Real daughters don't have to buy their place in a family. Real daughters aren't expected to disappear so everyone else can stay comfortable. The doubt never won. It didn't even linger. I had built something sturdier in its place. Self-trust. 1 year after the sale of the house, I stood in the same kitchen where my mother had once waved away $10,000 like it was nothing. The space looked different now. Not physically, but emotionally. That day had cracked something open in me. It hadn't just been about money. Or property. Or betrayal. It had been about permission. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop sacrificing. Permission to stop confusing endurance with virtue. I poured myself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter, thinking about how quiet my life had become. Quiet in the best way. I wasn't numb. I wasn't detached. I felt things deeply. I just wasn't drowning in other people's expectations anymore. For the first time, my future felt like something I was allowed to imagine. And I liked what I saw. By the time a full year had passed, the story no longer felt raw. It felt settled, like a scar that had healed cleanly instead of reopening every time I moved. I didn't replay the arguments anymore. I didn't rehearse imaginary conversations where I finally said the perfect thing. I didn't wait for apologies that were never coming. I had stopped hoping they would understand. That was the real turning point. Letting go of the need to be seen correctly by people who were committed to misunderstanding me. My name is Maeve Willey, and for most of my life, I believed love meant endurance. It meant staying even when it hurt. It meant absorbing damage quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. It meant being strong enough to carry everyone and invisible enough not to complain about the weight. Walking away rewrote that belief. It taught me that love without respect is not love. It's control dressed up as obligation. I didn't become colder after everything happened. I became clearer. I noticed how differently I moved through the world once I wasn't constantly bracing myself. I laughed more easily. I rested without guilt. I said no without rehearsing an apology in my head. I made decisions based on what made sense for me, not on how they might be received by people who had never protected my interests anyway. I stopped feeling like my life was on pause until everyone else was okay. Because they were never going to be okay as long as I existed to cushion their fall. I learned something important in therapy that stayed with me. Some people don't want resolution. They want access. And when access is denied, they call it cruelty. That had been my mother's final weapon. Rewriting the story so she was the wounded one, so I was the villain. But I no longer felt the need to defend myself against a version of reality that only existed to preserve her comfort. I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. That distinction mattered more than anything. Every now and then, I would pass by the neighborhood where the house used to be. I didn't slow down. I didn't feel the urge to look. That chapter was closed, not locked away in bitterness, but filed under lessons learned. I had reclaimed more than money. I had reclaimed authority over my own life. The silence between me and my family stretched on, uninterrupted. And with time, it stopped feeling like silence at all. It felt like space. Space to grow into someone I hadn't been allowed to be. Someone who didn't need permission to exist. Someone who understood that survival sometimes looks like walking away, even when everyone else calls it betrayal. They still tell the story their way, I'm sure. About how I chose money over family. About how I turned my back. About how they never saw it coming. What they never say is how much they took before I stopped letting them. And that's fine. I don't need my truth validated by the people who benefited most from my silence. I know what happened. I know what it cost. And I know that choosing myself saved my future.